and this is after multiple years of actually cleaning it up. And yeah, the project I was looking on was Dam Bennett, the impacts of the Wilson Lake Reservoir on the Sayakene of northern British Columbia. Um, I went to university supported by my nation. So my nation paid for my BA, they paid for my MA, they paid for my PhD. They knew that I was going to be working on this project. And in many ways, this is a project that the community wanted to have done. So there's been a lot of stuff said about the Bennett Dam, a lot of stuff said about the Wilson Lake Reservoir, not a lot actually reflecting what the community saw it as, how the community felt they were impacted, in particular, dividing up the communities. So just kind of going through what my findings were, what I was talking about my research methodologies is, I think, key here. And one of the things that's important to bear in mind is that it's important not to sell yourself short. So this is actually a photo from the Royal BC Museum. It's a photograph that was taken from the Pierre family's cabin prior to the construction of the Wilson Lake Reservoir by a BC forest crew individual who was burning cabins at the time, and it was donated to the museum. And many people would see this as kind of um, not necessarily something that's even possible, but people in the community were aware of it, and kind of highlights what life was like in the past. And this really kind of brought in what I wanted to look at was not only what are the impacts today, but also what was life like in the past. And that really gives us a sense of how far things have actually changed. And, this is my finding. So to them, reserves existed as a vague concept alone without a constant state presence to enforce Aboriginal policy. The Sayakene are free to continue living a traditional lifestyle that gradually included employment in the non-Sayakene economy. So one of the interesting aspects about working with my community, which is a First Nations community, as well as the related communities of Qudacha and McLeod Lake, is that a bit of our history deviates from kind of the standard Canadian Indigenous history, if there's even such a thing. Perhaps the biggest one is that we are far enough north and deep enough in the mountains that we would have Indian agents show up once a year. So there was never a constant presence on reserve. And indeed, when we talk about reserves, particularly prior to the Bennett Dam, reserves existed. People weren't necessarily kept on them. And a big part of that was just simply the isolated location of the community. And it wasn't until 2020, actually, that most of the people in my First Nation started living on a reserve. And that's just because our main village of Sayakene finally became a reserve in 2020. So it hadn't been a reserve really since the time that it was founded. And it just turned into one during the pandemic. But we do have a reserve that is on the other side of the reservoir that we use for farming. As far as I know, no one lives on it. No one has ever really lived on it. It just kind of existed there as something for the community. With regards to how did I find this information and a few more details just regards here, I'm not going to read over the slides in general because I'm talking about the methodological approach. The biggest way of finding this information was talking to the elders. So this project was community based. I interviewed elders in all three communities, and I interviewed a large number of the elders in the community. So we're a relatively small First Nation, a relatively small nation in general. So there's not that many Sayakene in the world. Very small. Each First Nation has about 500 band members. And of those band members, there's not that many elders remaining anymore. So there still are some, but not that many. And so when I talk about interviewing elders, I really was quite successful in interviewing the vast majority of them. And a big part of that was that I am from Sayakene, with family in Qudacha and McLeod Lake. So there's that community connection there. Another big part of this was the simple fact that the elders were interested in actually having the history of the Bennett Dam produced from a Sayakene perspective. That had never happened before. So they're very interested in actually having their say. And in some instances, it was as simple as actually talking about what life was like before the dam, what life was like after the dam, their own personal stories, the good parts, the bad parts, the trauma, all of that sort of stuff. Other times it was very much political leadership. So the chief at the time wanting to actually be able to be on record and say, this is what actually happened, this is what actually occurred. And so a lot of the findings here are based not so much on the written record per se, but based on the oral record. And in some instances, and indeed I would say in a lot of instances, having talked to the elders, if I visited the archives, which I did, the archives often supported what the elders were actually saying. But the key here was talking to the elders first instead of just going to the archives and then going to the elders. So, providing the elders the place of privilege that they truly deserve. And this brought out some interesting aspects. A big one here, if you look here, you can see my cursor, is with regards to residential school. So the residential school that most of the members of my nation went to was LeJac. It didn't open until 1922, but elders talked about summer schools existing in Caribou Hide, Fort Graham, and Cloud Lake, as well as Fort Ware. So there were day schools that existed, summer schools that existed, and elders really wanted to kind of talk about that with regards to what that meant for the continuation of culture and language, but also with regards to kind of a larger conversation surrounding residential schools, as well as the impacts of the dam itself. Um, Another key component of actually looking at the project was answering kind of this burning question a lot of elders had and had since the actual creation of the Wilson Lake Reservoir in 1968. How did this happen? How did this occur? Who was responsible? Who actually did this? And kind of the short answer is Axel Wenner-Gren, a Swedish industrialist, owner of Electrolux. In many ways, was kind of the individual who started the Bennett Dam, who started the Peace River Canyon Dam, who started Site C. It was his company that proposed all of these projects, and there was a little bit of skullduggery with regards to it. So getting into the second chapter, getting into some of the findings, one thing that was key is talking to the elders is that people had been talking about developing the traditional territory for decades, centuries at this point in time. Nobody had actually done so. So when Axel Wenner-Gren's people started talking about building a monorail, or started building a dam, the Peace River Project, people didn't really believe them with regards to that. Similarly, a lot of the elders are quite clear that the federal government, the provincial government hadn't actually told them about what was actually occurring. And this is important because there was actually some research done in the 1990s where I want to say a well-meaning researcher, and I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt, argued that the federal government and the provincial government had warned the people, but the people were too culturally different to actually understand the warning, which I found to be very problematic, to say the least, about that. But a lot of the elders are quite clear that there was indeed no warning provided, no information that was useful. And they weren't necessarily in a position to properly fight it. So there's that aspect that comes into play. And when I mentioned the skullduggery, Axel Wenner-Gren was the person who had the company that actually proposed this dam. One of the people he employed was Percy Gray, and Percy Gray later on in his life would actually talk about how he visited people in the community while he was planning this project, but also how he purposely kept it a secret from people in the communities that he was visiting. So he had these big dreams of building dams, flooding the traditional territory, and he was taking advantage of people's hospitality and not telling them even that, I might build a dam, or I'm here to actually look into building a dam. There also is the issue of aerial surveys. This was something that was important with regard to talking to elders. A lot of the elders at this point in time had actually been guides for a lot of surveyors prior to the 1950s. And so the fact that they moved to aerial surveys and not on the ground surveys meant that there was this disconnect between the elders and the actual surveyors that hadn't necessarily existed in the past. And then there's just the simple fact that the province decided to move forward with this. But again, a big part of this was talking with the elders, actually listening to them, asking them what happened, what they knew, and then taking what questions they had and actually looking for answers, and then reporting this back to community. And one of the things that I was kind of astounded to find out was that Williston Lake was supposed to be bigger. So this is a map showing the proposed or expected size of the actual hydroelectric reservoir. The yellow is what it actually ended up being. The purple and the red are kind of what they originally thought it would be. So there were questions regarding where it actually go, what territories would actually flood out, what communities would be affected. And again, this was something that wasn't necessarily communicated to people in Fort Graham or Sekirene, Fort Ware, Kodacha, or McLeod Lake. So there wasn't a lot of information that was provided with regards to that. And part of this was the provincial government at the time. This was the premier of BC at the time, W.A.C. Bennett. Yeah, he really pushed through this project, but he also pushed through this project in a situation where Indian Affairs was not willing or able to actually push back in any way, shape, or form. So, no proper consultation, no consideration of the actual impacts itself, and of course, this has had negative impacts on the nation when the traditional territory was actually flooded, when it was destroyed by the reservoir. It was also important to point out that consultation, I have it in scare marks here, very limited, if you want to call it consultation at that. And I'd say very limited. They invited one of the chiefs, the chief of McLeod Lake, to attend the public hearings for the actual reservoir. As he himself told me, he was told by the Indian agent, "You are here to be the chief in the room. We expect you to say nothing other than that you approve of the project. And if you say anything other than that you approve of the project, you'll be in a lot of trouble." So he was very clear about that. For the other nations, they didn't even bother inviting the chief. So there was no attempt at consultation there. It is important to note that there also were issues with regards to where information was provided. For some reason, most of the information was put into newspapers in the Peace region of British Columbia. But for those three nations, McLeod Lake, Seke, and Kodacha, the main community they would actually go to would be Prince George. So, even if they had seen it in the newspapers, or even if they could have seen the newspapers, it wasn't in the newspapers for them to actually see. This brings us to the tree crusher. This is one of the world's largest tree crushers, and it gets into kind of the way the dam was actually constructed. So the end result was this lack of information and the federal-provincial conflict over creating new reserves. Was the Sakonay population as a whole did not truly understand the effects of the Peace River Project. In the case of the Fort Graham section of the Finley River Band, we're left without a habitable reserve when the water began to rise. And this really was where I talked to a lot of elders in my own community of Sekirene, or as we were known then, the Fort Graham Band, or the Fort Graham section of the Finley River Band. Yeah, there was no reserve. So 1968, the main reserve was flooded, and it wasn't until 1971 that new reserves were actually ready for people to move on to. So even the date here of 1969, that's when new reserves are created. It took 2 years for Indian Affairs to even let people move on to these reserves if they wanted to. So that's a 3-year period without any place to actually be. The end result was a lot of people were living in logging camps, temporary logging camps, dealing with the fact that the reservoir was ever increasing and that the structures they're living in were purposely built to be very temporary. So, again, not a lot of information provided, but also complicated by the fact that people in the community did take advantage of some of the forestry boom that was associated with the building of the dam. But there is a disconnect, as a lot of the elders told me, between being involved in these activities and actually understanding in proper detail what these activities entail. So there is that aspect. And this is the W.A.C. Bennett Dam, the dam that flooded my traditional territory, at least the heart of my traditional territory. It was at one point in time the world's largest dam. You can see a truck right here. It actually has a 2-lane paved road on the top of the dam itself. So it is very large indeed, blocks a lot of water, and generates a lot of electricity. So, and this is really where we get into the impacts of the dam, and perhaps one of the biggest things that I heard from the elders was just how traumatic the actual creation of the Williston Lake Reservoir was, what they went through, what they were aware of, what they knew, what they were learning, but also this sense that no information had actually been provided. So, ideally, from the province's perspective, this period following the completion of the dam would be a non-event. In reality, it was far from that. So the province had failed to properly clear the reservoir basin. It also failed to inform people still living and working in how flooding would proceed. And this resulted in the Sekedi not only being caught off guard, but also unaware of exactly what was happening and what to do. The new debris-filled reservoir hampered transportation in the trench, and three communities found themselves increasingly isolated from another. So, again, I was interviewing elders. A lot of elders talked about traveling on the reservoir when it was first being created, traveling on their using their river boats, and either getting stuck or having their boat sink because of the debris. And in some instances, being very worried not only about their own lives, but also their children's lives, their family members' lives, friends' lives. Just a lot of concern over what had actually happened or whether or not they could actually still travel in the traditional territory on the reservoir itself. Um, and why did this happen? The government was quite clear. They were trying to save money. So it's bottom line. They didn't clear the reservoir basin because they didn't want to spend more money than they had to. Um, then they didn't necessarily provide a lot of information to people. So one of the things elders pointed out is that not only were they caught unaware, but community or settler communities, friends they might have who are non-CKNA were also caught off guard. So not a lot of information we provide to anyone in general. And this creation of this cesspool with strong winds, unstable banks, and waves that disrupted transportation and isolated the three nations from each other. And this is one of, I think, the highlights of doing this as a community-based project. A lot of the literature, it's written by non-Indigenous people, presents the three nations as categorically separate. So there's Fort Ware, there's Sekherenea, there's McLeod Lake. Some people would even say that the fact that we're grouped together as the Sekene is just a modern invention. But when I talked to the elders in the community, it was quite clear that in many ways we were one nation and that it was actually the reservoir that split us up into three nations. Elders are quite clear about that and about those connections there. Again, getting into what are the impacts, the government expected us to go to our reserves. So that was the general response. And a lot of elders began to talk about what life on the reserve was actually like, what impact it had on the actual community, and directly tied it to the creation of this dam, the creation of this reservoir. And then we get into the Fort Graham section within the river band. And this is in 1979, two things happened. 5 families moved onto the Parsnip Reserve. Those families wouldn't remain on the Parsnip Reserve. The rest of the community relocated to the Angenika Point, to the old village of Angenika, and become squatters in their own territory. And that was the terminology that was used at the time. And then recognizing that there is diversity within the nation, recognizing that the impacts of the reservoir affected the communities differently, I did research looking at not only the Sekene as a nation, but also the individual bands. So what impacts did this have on them as individual bands? And the first one I'm going to talk about here is McLeod Lake. And the image here is actually Fort McLeod. This is the oldest permanent European settlement west of the Rockies. It's a National Historic Site twice over. And one of the things that elders were quite upset about to this day is that in order to turn it into a National Historic Site, they had to move the village away from the National Historic Site. So the village is now not necessarily a fair distance away from this location, but it is separate from this location. Whereas historically, this would have been just 3 buildings in the overall village as a whole. So again, with regards to McLeod Lake, this site is an interesting source of pain, but it's also interesting because the community has in many ways co-opted the site. So as a National Historic Site, not that well known. most of the people who use it are from McLeod Lake. So the nation does use it kind of as their own location. Also, just kind of looking into kind of the impact on the community. And one of the big questions that I had as a Sekene man, a Sekene band member with family in McLeod Lake, as well as Quadacha, was why did McLeod Lake sign on to Treaty 8? And they signed on to Treaty 8 relatively late. So they were 1999, 2000. So this is well after the signing of Treaty 8. And one of the responses I got was that it was all about control, and this sense that after the construction of the reservoir, McLeod Lake wanted to secure control over their traditional territory in order to hold back and control the colonization and development that engulfed them. And ultimately, one of their solutions that they pursued was an adhesion to Treaty 8. And this is the simple fact that in British Columbia, reserves are incredibly small, but the reserve formula that's found in Treaty 8 is very large. So one of the things that they saw as beneficial. So um, again, part of this too was a desire to live a traditional way of life. And so a lot of elders in McLeod Lake would talk about how the development that followed the Wilson Lake Reservoir, followed the construction of the WAC Bennett Dam, as well as the fact that the province and the federal government expected them to live on reserve, meant that they couldn't use much of the traditional territory. And so by signing Treaty 8, there was a hope that they would get more reserve land, and ultimately they would get a lot more reserve land. So there was that aspect there. And there was also the sense of wanting to prevent other developments. And perhaps the biggest one they talked about was the McGregor diversion, which is another hydroelectric project that would have flooded a huge portion of McLeod Lake's traditional territory. So they're able to successfully stop that. This can be juxtaposed with Quadacha or Fort Ware, which is the northern community. And this is actually an image of the band office and health clinic being built when I was doing the research. This is the bridge over the Finley River. And this bridge was only constructed in 1990. So the ability to even drive to Fort Ware or to Seke is something that's only existed since 1989. Prior to that, it was boat access or airplane access alone. So one of the things with regards to Quadacha, not so much concerned about having control over the traditional territory. In Quadacha, the big issue was isolation. So as the band came to realize the enormous task of trying to deal with the impacts of the reservoir, its solution was to seek outside assistance, not only from the colonial state, but also through various indigenous organizations. And yeah, one of the key things that came into play was that the reservoir had disrupted a centuries-old transportation network. So talking to the elders, trying to understand what the impact on the community was. The big one was simply transportation, getting actual supplies into the community. How do you do it? And related to this, the increase in unemployment immediately following the construction of the dam, the creation of the reservoir, combined with an overall cost of living increase. So if things are hard to actually get into community, things tend to go up in price. So there was that issue there. And increasingly, the nation not only looked to the province and BCI to try and fix their mistake, but also formed alliances with other Indigenous organizations like the Cascadenea Council. So again, very important, but also something that really came out in talking to the elders. And then just kind of going on to my own community, the building here is the band office slash school. So just giving you a sense of the community itself. Here, a sense of wanting the isolation that plagued Fort Ware in order to not only escape the development that engulfed McLeod Lake, but also pursue a traditional lifestyle. So for all three communities, I would say the elders are quite clear about wanting to live a traditional lifestyle. But I would say that particularly in Sekadene or Anjanika, as it was formerly known, there was a lot more conversation about how evil the actual village was. And it wasn't necessarily the village was bad and that people were acting bad. It was this view that even living in a village, even living in a settlement like this was contrary to the traditional way of life. So there was that aspect in play. And this also relates kind of the way the nation reacted to the Bennett Dam, the way it responded. I already mentioned that a lot of people had moved up to Indonesia Point rather than going to the Parsnip Reserve. Ultimately, from 1979 or 71 to 1989, the nation would resist attempts to try and get them to move on to reserve. They would ignore the provincial government, they ignore the federal government, and the end result would be that by 1989, the provincial government and the federal government would actually propose building a new village, Sekerene. But as I mentioned, a lot of elders weren't particularly happy about that. So, just kind of getting into some of the common aspects, and I would say this is one of the key parts of the research and one of the key issues that still faces all three nations to this day. This is an image of a graveyard at Fort Graham. All three communities talked about the loss of graves, talked about how graves are under the water, talked about how they were not removed, but also talked about how they were promised that they would be removed. And I was able to find out through my research that one, the person who was supposed to be sharing information with the communities became scared after one meeting because people didn't like hearing the traditional territory was going to be flooded, and so decided to just basically tell people what they wanted to hear. And I learned this from an elder who actually was bringing them from community to community. The other aspect that came into play is that I was able to find out that the reason why the graves weren't removed, even though it was promised that they would be removed, is that British Columbia had adopted a policy of not moving graves older than 70 years. They also adopted a policy of not moving graves if they couldn't determine who the living descendants were of the person who was buried. And as an Indigenous community, they really didn't try to find out if people were still alive who might have ancestors who were buried. So it's kind of that perfect storm of horribleness, if you want to see it that way. But there also was the sense that the WAC Bennett Dam had divided the Seikene. It affected all three bands differently, and they pursued their own way to deal with unique situations. Many of the impacts of the dam are common to all three bands, and this fact isn't always recognized. And I actually found some rather interesting material that was written looking at McLeod Lake, looking at Fort Ware, looking at the social breakdown. And when you talk to the elders, very much associated with the WAC Bennett Dam, the impacts of the WAC Bennett Dam. But these works that were written by outsiders were really confused as to why this breakdown had occurred, or simply blamed the breakdown on kind of the standard history of Indigenous people in Canada without a particular context. One person even talked about there maybe being a curse in the community or something like that. It was also very clear that the three bands do actually take attempts to try and strengthen the community. So there is that aspect there. Again, the Williston Lake Reservoir destroyed the heart of Seikene traditional territory. So elders are quite clear about that. Elders would talk about how the remainder of the territory was like a torn up shirt. The best parts were underwater, and how this impacted the ability not only to spread culture, but also just simply conduct land-based learning in general. So larger issues there. Elders also talked about how the very environment had changed, how the animals, the plants had changed. They also talked about the large number of animals that had actually drowned in the reservoir. And in some instances talked about their own efforts to try and save animals, and often successfully doing so. There also was this general sense of a lack of compensation. And so as part of my research, I was not only able to present these findings to community, which I did in all three communities, but also kind of talk to some of the elders about what had actually happened with the compensation that they had been provided and why it was so low, and why they, in some instances, had actually not seen any of the money. And the short answer was that the provincial government determined compensation on the premise that Indigenous people are not hard workers, and therefore paying people for their trap line wouldn't be at market value, it would be well below market value. And then from Indian Affairs perspective, they just kept the money for band members. So it was never actually given to them. So It was also interesting looking at kind of the social breakdown in the communities, but also documenting it. And this is possible not only through talking with elders, talking with community members, but also looking through some of the government records that exist, particularly in British Columbia. And I do say in British Columbia, uh, BC for years kept a separate death registry for First Nations individuals that was divided by band or by First Nation. And so by going through those records, I was able to provide some fairly firm evidence that, the elders were right, that prior to the reservoir, all of the things that are kind of associated with negatives in Indigenous communities weren't actually happening. So there wasn't a huge number of deaths from alcohol prior to the construction of the reservoir. Drugs were the same, violence was the same. Yeah, it just didn't happen. People were dying from old age, people were dying from disease, and not disease tied to alcohol or drug abuse, just kind of the common diseases that kill people. So that was really interesting in actually showing that that indeed was the case, not only from what the elders had told me, but also from the government records. So very clear that the reservoir, the impacts of it, had actually contributed to this. And then finally, just highlighting the fact that the three nations often do come together. So the suggestion that the connection between them is weak, maybe it's invented by non-Indigenous people, is not actually the case. And it's really interesting because people in all three nations will talk about how there are separate bands, but they'll also talk about how there's one nation. And how they're all the same or we're all the same. So this really sense of community. And then also through my interviews with elders, but also my engagement with elders, I was able to actually construct a family tree, not only for my nation, but also for Quadacha and McLeod Lake. And ultimately, it began to expand into a whole host of neighboring First Nations. So a few years ago, I actually had the joy of teaching an oral literatures class. And as part of that project, students had to make a family tree. And so there were a lot of Indigenous students in northern BC who found out that I'm related to them as they presented their family tree and talked about their family history. But that was part of this project, part of this engagement with the community. And just wanted to give credit to the elders. And this is a rather famous photo. Frank Swinnell took this photo of the Sekani chiefs in 1911. Yeah, this individual here is Charlie Hunter, great grandfather, many times older of me. But truth be told, I'm related to all of these men, all of these different chiefs. So, kind of looking into the history of the community and talking to the elders, and just wanted to highlight just the sheer number of elders that I actually interviewed. 24 elders in Quadacha. And again, Quadacha has a population of about 500. Most of the 500 are not elders. So this is the vast majority of the elders in community, including a number of elders who have since passed away. So very beneficial, very interesting to actually get their perspective on what had actually occurred. And then, starting with the elders also helped inform my work in the archives. I worked with other sources as well. So, for example, the Van Summers here, Donnie was not only chief at that point in time, but when a lot of the stuff was written about the high cost of shipping in goods, the cost of groceries, how hard it was to bring things in, his dad was actually running the store at that point in time. So very, very interesting to kind of get the perspective of not only the Van Summer family, but also use that to inform the stuff that was written about the community itself. And then also learn other information about what it means to be Sekene. So there's a wonderful oral tradition. I learned about the Ignell family, which wasn't tied to the Bennett Dam at all, but was actually tied to how we're supposed to relate to the four-legged relatives, to the animals, and also the dangers of what actually can occur if you don't treat the animals with respect. So one of the benefits of doing this project, I would say, is that it was a wonderful avenue to actually connect with elders, actually learn from elders. And, some days I would do tons of interviews. Other days I would just sit on my uncle's porch and just talk with him, visit with him all day. So it's not an interview. I'm just connecting with community. So very beneficial in that sense. Similarly, with regards to McLeod Lake, interviewed around 25 elders. Some of the elders already had done interviews, but again, important to connect with community and important to kind of challenge some of the stereotypes that exist about Indigenous history in Canada. And I say that because Andrew Salonis is an interesting individual. He fought in World War II. He did not lose his status. He actually became the chief of the nation for many years and is actually the father of a lot of the Salonises listed here. Although the brother of Michael Salonis, who was also chief of the nation as well. So, and I just wanted to say, with regards to family connections, where is he? Right here, Albert. Albert was very adamant and very much wanted to tell me that he was related to people in my community and my nation. So he really wanted to get that across. Whereas Harry Chinji, who was the chief at the hearing, very much wanted to talk about what the hearing was like, wanted to talk about what the process was like, wanted to talk about how he was trying to do the best he could do in a very colonial situation, and really, in many ways, had his hands tied. So, very important to kind of get that across. And then just within my own community, so the different elders that I interviewed, and this one was particularly interesting because again, a lot of these people are aunts and uncles, but also kind of capturing what the community perspective was, and very, very meaningful in the sense that I had grown up hearing about the Wilson Lake Reservoir my entire life, but to actually work on something regarding it. And I was very pleased. There was a collection of oral traditions that was released in the 1980s, made by the nation. And somebody interviews my dad, and my dad says, I don't know much about the Wilson Lake Reservoir. So I'm currently getting my research published into a book, and I'm planning on using that as kind of the opening quote with regards to that. So, and yeah, that's it. So if there's any questions, please ask them.
Thank you. Thank you so much for an awesome presentation. So the floor is open, and I'd like to invite my students to ask questions. I'll begin with the first one. How much time did it take you? How long have you been conducting this research?
It depends on how you actually look at the research, and that's one of the